Okay, everyone. So happy to see you all here. I'm reliably informed that more than 200 people are registered, so welcome also to the people online today. We really value and appreciate you all either being here or online. It really does help us as we share with you some of our thinking that's come out of a project called Children's Agency in the National Curriculum, The Promise of Structured Freedom. Oh, and there is a book, but more about that later. I want to introduce you indeed to Yana Manyukhina, my wonderful colleague. Yana's going to be speaking shortly, but we wanted you to see her first. And
Thank you everyone for coming.
She's not feeling 100%, so please go easy on her. So thanks, Yana. I'll carry on for now, and we'll see you back up here in a minute. For those of you who don't know, the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Pedagogy is a research centre devoted to improving young children, particularly primary and early years children's education and therefore life chances. And we specialise in pedagogy, which to some people is teaching and learning, but we have three themes, one of which is curriculum, one of which is social justice, and we also have a third theme, which is Children's Agency, exactly. So we're hosting tonight's event, and I have many people to thank, particularly Monica, who is on duty over there, and Ghassan, who's done a wonderful job, and our colleagues who are helping us with the technology. Very grateful to you. Thank you. So let me now turn to the formal bit. I get the pleasure of introducing Professor Mark Priestley, who I know quite well. In fact, Mark has kindly invited Yana and I up to the university in Stirling, because Mark is Professor of Education and Director of the Stirling Centre for Research into Curriculum Making, an important term and phrase that he really, I would say, has led the world on developing. Although Mark is very kind at introducing us to his campus, he insists on taking me up a rather high hill every time. Last time it was with his incredibly athletic partner and the dog. So I was left sort of trailing. I consider myself to be relatively fit, but so thank you for that as well, Mark. I'm going to hand over to Mark now. I'm really looking forward to what he's got to say. I'll have a brief sit down, and then Yana, you will be continuing. So over to Mark.
I'm very delighted to be with you, not in person in London, unfortunately, but to join you for the launch of this extremely important book. And huge congratulations to Yana and Dominic for such a great effort. I think this will be a very influential publication. I've got a question up on my screen, which is why agency matters in education. I'm not actually going to say very much about that. I'm going to conclude with a few reflections on that. But what I want to do is to reflect on some of the themes that have emerged from some review of the literature on teacher agency, which myself and Gert Biester have been doing for the second edition of our own book, Teacher Agency, which is going to be published next year. And I think one of the things, and this applies equally to children's agency as well as teacher agency, is that actually agency is a particularly slippery and difficult concept to pin down. And that seems to be, from our reading of the literature on teacher agency, to cause particular problems. I want to explore some of those. Let's start with some definitions. Agency has been traditionally framed, I think, in terms of individual capacity, and there are many definitions of agency in the literature. So these are three examples here, but I think what they represent here are overly individualistic views as agency as human capacity, which see agency as something that people possess to varying degrees, because of course some of these do take into account social mediating factors as well, but primarily what these definitions look at is agency as personal capacity or personal attributes of the individual, and I think that that's unhelpful. There are three distinct traditions which we can see in the agency literature. The first one has its roots largely in psychology. It's been associated particularly with the work of Bandura, and the caveat here, Bandura wasn't just talking about personal attributes. Bandura talked about the social mediation of agency as well. But primarily what the psychology or the agency as capacity conception sees is that agency is about personal attributes such as self-efficacy, motivation, self-determination, etc. And then there's a sociological tradition, of course, which has been framed largely around the agency structure debate. Now, this I think also tends to see agency as capacity, and agency is often framed in opposition to structure. And we've got traditions, for example, what Archer calls downwards conflation, where society is really what's significant in determining social action, or upwards conflation, where the individual is all powerful, and then of course attempts to reconcile the two, for example Giddens' theory of structuration. And then the final tradition here is agency as phenomenon, and this is where agency is seen as an analytical category in its own right, and there are various sort of traditions within this approach. For example, the sociocultural traditions, based often on cultural historical activity theory, the ecological view that we put forward in our work, and post-humanist conceptions of agency. Now, I want to say a little bit more about the ecological conception of agency, and this really takes the view that agency is not a personal attribute. It's not something that people have or that's innate to the individual. Instead, it's something that people achieve, and that happens in unique and ever-changing situations. So we have a situation, for example, where agency may be very evident in one context and then completely absent or virtually absent in another. And really what this is about is the interaction of the individual and the context or conditions for action that they're immersed in. And agency in this sense can be defined as the quality of the engagement of actors with the temporal relational context for action. So it's not a quality of the actors, nor is it the actions. It's the way in which people are able to engage. And we can characterize the quality as agentic when individuals actually achieve this possibility to give directions to their actions. Now, I want to just have a few words about what agency is not, and a lot of the literature does start to conflate various terms here. The first one, I think, is that agency is not the same as autonomy, and this is captured very nicely in the title of the project and book that Yana and Dominic have been engaged in. So if we understand autonomy as relative freedom from control, we can take the view that actually removing the structures, the constraints of, for example, curriculum policy might actually reduce agency because they remove conceptual resources and frameworks which are essential for people. So agency, in my view, is not autonomy. I think also, and this is another major trend we see in the literature, agency I don't think is action. It's not the same thing, but many accounts do talk about agency in terms of action. Some of these do seem to replace agency with action altogether. In some cases, they are including the notion of action in agency. And just drawing your attention here to really two trends we see. One is a trend to see agency in terms of change agentry. In other words, agency in terms of enacting policies from governments, etc. And then another one which sits in opposition to this, agency as resistance to those very same policies and agendas. So what we're seeing here, I think, is a conflation of agency, the possibility to take action, with the action itself. And this, I think, leads to further fallacies. An interesting one here, and this is a very, I think, interesting trend in the literature, is a conflation of agency with action and leading to the notion of collective agency. And I think there are two aspects to this. First of all, that these writers are conflating agency with the conditions that shape agency, for example, the relational structures. And we can point to Anne Edwards' work, where Anne Edwards talked about relational agency being very explicitly the ability to draw upon relational resources. And somehow in some of the writing, this has become collective agency. And then the other thing is the tendency, I think, to conflate agency with its effects, with the actions. And a good example of that is how some writers have used Margaret Archer's notion of corporate agents to talk about agency as collective, when in fact what they're talking about is collective actions here. Okay, so I'm going to just finish very briefly now with some reflections on why agency matters, and I'm focusing here on two aspects: teacher agency, in other words, the conditions, the agency that's required for teachers to be critical engagers with policy, with educational issues, with educational purpose, and people who are able to take actions to enact policy or to enact educational practice. So that's one aspect I think we need to raise here. But I think also we need to think about children's agency in terms of how children are better equipped to engage meaningfully with education. And this would include things like motivation, for example. It would include the development of future capacity to become active, ethical, and critical participants in society. And my final slide here really is to make a plea that we shouldn't then be seeing agency in terms of just building individual capacity. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. That we need to think about how we also address the structures which surround educational contexts. For example, thinking about how we build relational resources for future agency in teachers and young people, but also how we address some of the power imbalances in our education system that serve to limit agency. And then culturally, we need to think about how we introduce new ideas, interrupt current thinking about education, because agency is also about thinking about future imaginaries and what might be possible in the future. And strong agency is about thinking of how we might do things differently. So I'm going to finish on those notes, and I think we have some time for questions now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for really stimulating start tonight. It was really interesting. Well, many things to see the way you'd very simply but powerfully presented teacher agency alongside children's agency, and I think that's something that Yana and I have wrestled with and continue to wrestle with. I liked your ideas of looking to the future. I think I want to say a little bit about a particular future when Yana and I get our chance to just say a few words to everyone. Now, you are very welcome to ask a question, make an observation. If you keep them relatively brief, I'd be grateful. Emily, if there's anybody online with any particular question, that's also fine. So I'm going to just pause for a moment and give people a chance to put their hand up or indicate that they'd like to ask a question. You're more than welcome, or an observation, or make a connection with your own work if you wish. And if not, I'm sure one of my colleagues will have... thank you, Lucy.
Could I ask you to say a bit more about relational resources and what they might look like?
I'll give you an example then. Thank you for the question. That's a good question. I think this goes to the heart of what Anne Edwards was talking about when she talked about relational agency. And there's a separate question about whether it's helpful, of course, to coin these different types of agency. But we'll put that on one side. So in terms of relational resources, we found in 2 secondary schools we did our original research in that there was a distinct difference in the agency achieved by teachers. They were very similar in lots of respects, but very different types of agency achieved. And what we found was that there were very different types of relationships, professional relationships in the two contexts. So in the first school, relationships were primarily hierarchical, top-down. One teacher described them like school assemblies. In the other school, there was substantial evidence of horizontal relations, informal working and networking amongst teachers. So for me, what's really important about relational resources is that people are embedded in networks, that teachers, for example, are embedded in networks, and that those networks provide people with access to ideas, support, motivation, protection, etc., for engaging in their curriculum making in the case of our particular project. And I think that we could apply the same sort of issues to children. If we want children to be agentic in their daily lives, then being able to draw upon the resources provided by interactions with others, I think, is really helpful there. I think that's probably enough to say at the moment. I'm happy to elaborate further.
Thank you very much, Mark. We've got a question from somebody online that Emily's going to share.
Hi, Mark. The question is, how is the concept of agency addressed in the current curriculum and assessment review?
You're asking a difficult question for me here because I've not really had much engagement with that review. My suspicion is probably not a great deal. In terms of teacher agency, I think that there is a real role for policy to be framed in terms of providing facilitated frameworks rather than restrictive prescriptions. And it may be that the current curriculum review is involved in doing that. in my own context, Scotland, we are undertaking a review of curriculum, and what we're seeing, I think, is a recognition that the current technical framework of the curriculum actually restricts teachers' agency because it encourages them basically to adopt audit tick box approaches to developing the curriculum. Whereas what's been proposed, I think, is a much more conceptually based curriculum framework, which will provide teachers with the resources to think about their practice, to think about issues like progression, for example. And that, I think, is where policy can provide much more affordance for agency than it currently does in Scotland. But as I said, I can't really comment in detail in England because I haven't engaged in depth with the framework that's been proposed.
Well, Mark, I hope to help you out there a bit later with a few thoughts. Can we all show our one quick one, if it's a quick one.
Just a group of people who seem to be missing so far in the conversation, which is teaching assistants, because children are important in schools and teachers are important in schools, but actually a lot of the work happens through teaching assistants. Yeah,
I think that's a really helpful point. Thank you. So can we just show our appreciation to Mark? Thank you so much, Mark. I'm going to hand over to Yana.
And I'm introducing our next keynote speaker, Dr. Tracy Curran, who is the director of the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, who is joining us online. And as I'm looking at these notes, I'm reminded that, and Dom will remember this as well, that actually our concern with children's agency can be traced back to our project that we did for the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment almost over 8 years ago now, which was also the very first project I got to do as I joined UCL. A lot of symbolic meaning here, so I'm really grateful to Tracy for joining us online today.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Yana. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a huge privilege to be here with you for the launch of Dominic and Yana's new book on children's agency in national curriculum. A very influential and timely publication, and one that I'm confident will leave a lasting mark on how we think about the role of children in their own learning, not just as learners, but as agents. And as someone working in national curriculum development in Ireland, I've seen firsthand the power and complexity of making child agency a core part of national education reform. And that's what I hope to contribute to the seminar this afternoon. This experience has shown that it's one thing to write about agency in policy documents, but it's another to attempt to breathe life into it in classrooms. And as we now move in Ireland from curriculum development, having completed recently a full new suite of primary curriculum specifications to support the enactment of the curriculum and realise the vision for the curriculum in real terms, this remains very prevalent and dominant in our thinking and discussions here in Ireland as we work this out in practice. So why agency and why now? Well, with this book, Dominic and Yana articulate something many of us in curriculum reform have felt for a long time, that curriculum, pedagogy and assessment are not neutral structures. They can constrain, but crucially, they can also enable. And in the case of Ireland's new primary curriculum framework, we've made a very deliberate choice to design structures that enable curriculum agency. And indeed, Dominic, who has been a strong proponent of child agency across all aspects and in supporting us in this work as a member of our international advisory panel as well. In Ireland, the new primary framework, with it, agency is not tucked away in the margins. It's embedded in its core principles of engagement and participation. Children are described explicitly as having the capacity to act independently and to make choices about and in their learning. This is more than rhetoric. It's curriculum policy. It's a commitment. Notwithstanding, and Dominic and Yana's book reminds us of this, that the mere presence of agency as a term in a curriculum document is not enough. And I think Mark would agree with this as well. The challenge lies in how we actualise that agency through teaching, through culture, and through assessment that values the learner as much as the learning. Reading through the book, I think one of the most powerful insights from chapter 2 is the idea of curriculum as dynamic interaction, not as static delivery. So Bernstein reminds us of the message systems that run through curriculum, what's taught, how it's taught, and how it's assessed. Dominic and Yana's take this further by showing us how those message systems either silence or elevate the voice of the learner. which I thought was really interesting to think about going through the book. In Ireland, our move towards a curriculum framework rather than a fixed prescriptive document was a deliberate attempt to loosen the grip or perception of standardisation and instead promote professional judgment and child-centred learning. It's a recognition that co-construction between teacher and child is where the real magic of learning happens. And I think it's fair to say that that's what this book does so effectively. It pushes us to move beyond rhetorical commitment to agency and towards practical curriculum architecture and infrastructures that invite children's views into the daily business of learning in schools. So if we think of research as maybe fuel for reform, well, then the Chant project that's described later in the book is a really valuable reminder that listening to children is not just good practice, it's good research. And it gives us insight into what curriculum feels like from the learner's perspective. In Ireland, we have been fortunate to glean many of these insights through a longitudinal research study called Children's School Life Studies. I'm not sure if people are familiar with it, but it's essentially a landmark study that was commissioned by NCCA to capture the experiences of almost 4,000 children in Ireland across 5 years of data collection. And among the wealth of insights that the study provided into the experiences of children, it reveals something similar across many contexts. That children feel heard when it comes to rules and behaviour, but far less so when it comes to learning itself. And that told us something really important. And it shows us that in Ireland, our systems still have some way to go. Dominic and Yana's research helps us articulate and challenge this imbalance and offers evidence and encouragement that when we support agency, outcomes improve, not just academically, but also socially and emotionally. Another thread I wanted to draw from the book, and something we have wrestled with and continue to wrestle with in Ireland, is how to balance knowledge and agency. So the tension between knowledge-rich curricula and child-centred learning, many argue, has been a historical fault line. But as Dewey reminds us, and as echoed in the book, this is a false dichotomy. A curriculum that values agency doesn't ignore knowledge, it contextualises it. It roots learning and curiosity, and it treats the child as a meaning maker, not just a knowledge recipient. And in our redeveloped primary curriculum, we're moving away from prescriptive and subject-based learning towards broad areas of learning, languages, STEM, well-being, the arts, and social and environmental education, allowing for greater integration, choice, and child-led exploration. This isn't about lowering standards, it's about deepening learning while honouring children's interests, voices, and real life experiences. In Dominic and Yana's book, they use the term structured freedom. And I think that this might just be the sweet spot for future curriculum development and enactment, where guidance and flexibility and national standards and local priorities can meet, where professional trust and accountability coexist, where children's voice is embedded in practice and in principle. Ireland is not perfect. No country is. We certainly don't purport to have the panacea to this and that we've worked it all out. But by embedding agency in the DNA of our redeveloped primary curriculum, and by listening, really listening closely to our stakeholders, teachers and children, and more importantly, by acting on what we hear and mobilising to ensure the right structures are in place, we're attempting to come good on the promise of structured freedom for our students and for our schools, so that our curriculum translates into lived experience for children that says, you know, you belong here, your ideas matter, and your learning journey is one that we will shape together. And I think Mark, as part of his input, pointed to many other aspects as well that we'll need to address this and achieve this ultimately. So just Dominic and Yana, thank you both so much for the invitation to support the launch of your book today. I believe it offers us both the scholarship to support agency as well as the language to advocate for it. This book, and indeed other work that you have done to date, has encouraged me, and I think encourages us all to consider what kind of learners and citizens can we nurture when we truly honour children's agency. And I, for one, am sincerely hopeful and excited to see what the future brings in this regards. Congratulations to you both.
Thank you, Tracy, for this wonderful talk. Any questions in the audience or online? Oh, we have a question. Yes, it's an online question.
Yeah, so question from Jarlath. Has a greater emphasis on agency in Ireland had any impact on children's behaviour?
It's probably a little bit early for us to say. because we have we published the curriculum framework itself in March 2023, but the new specifications are going to be introduced into our system from September this year. Now, we certainly would have trialed aspects of this through the introduction of the primary mathematics curriculum with low-level emphasis in the professional development for teachers around agency. So we certainly would have promoted this, but there is going to be a stronger emphasis in teachers' professional learning experiences and I suppose at policy level, a stronger drive to build capacity for agency, particularly at initial teacher education and at in-service levels for teachers. So I probably would be able to answer that question a little bit better with more time, but certainly we are hoping that ultimately this will lead to improved outcomes for children, not just I suppose in terms of achievement, in terms of their learning, but also I think as the book describes the importance of the impact on their social and emotional development as well.
Thank you. Any more questions in the audience, perhaps?
I'll stay in my seat, Tracy, if I may. Thank you, by the way, so much for that talk. That has set my mind absolutely racing, really interesting. But I just wanted to come back to this research you and your colleagues have done, because it shows to me you're talking about your commitment and Ireland's commitment to children's agency, and everything I've seen and heard makes me believe it's real. For example, the work you've done with, I believe, 2-year-old children.
Yeah.
In terms of their agency, could you say a few words about that? Because I think that is, really very interesting indeed.
So the study that I spoke about is the CSL Children's School Life study, and I've put a link in the chat for the link to the website where that research can be found. We also have an ASHTR framework in Ireland, which is our early childhood education framework. And research in support of the development and updating of the ASHTR framework, we commissioned research with babies and toddlers. And so while some people might pose the question, how are you going to research with babies and toddlers? We worked with a very specialized research team who used very bespoke and specialized methodologies to engage with and elicit the views of babies and toddlers. That's also a research report that's available on our website, ncca.ie, if anyone would be interested. But a core part of the report was to extract recommendations for curriculum. But as part of, I suppose, the approach that we've been trying to adopt, we really were trying to come full circle to not just gather the voices of babies and toddlers, and in the case of children's school lives, of children in primary school, but also to feed that back to those who had contributed their voices, to generate child-friendly reports, to be able to share back and echo what we have heard from children, and then to look at how we can have influence, where we can give that voice influence in terms of policy as well. So not simply just gathering the voices of babies, toddlers and children, but actually looking at how this can really influence and impact policy as well.
Hi, so the online question from Norman, how has the Irish Governmental Education Department reacted to the research that you've discussed?
So this has been an investment by our government. We're a national agency and our funding is coming from the department. And so research is one of the 4 cornerstones for how curriculum is developed in Ireland. And so there would certainly be an expectation in relation to looking at and dedicating research to this area. In terms of the findings from the research, I suppose in NCCA, we play a really important role in not just ensuring that this is fed through our structures in terms of curriculum development. And so what we would do is we will take the research and we will bring this to our board members, we will bring it to our council members, but also to individual development groups as well who are working on specifications. But in addition to this, because it's publicly funded, we will also work to disseminate this more widely. And so we work with the media to share the findings. Sometimes they're good news stories for our education system. Sometimes they pose challenges as well. But in the spirit of transparency, it's really important that we open this up and we discuss it. I mean, I know from a recent report that looked at the inequalities in children's lives, it raised some really, really challenging issues for us in Ireland. But that's an opportunity for us to leverage that research And we worked in particular with the social inclusion unit in the Department of Education and Youth here in Ireland to really action plan and problem solving over the coming years in direct response to what children told us about the inequalities that they experienced in primary school.
Thank you, Tracy. Yes, and one more question from the audience.
Thank you for your talk. I'm just wondering, how do you reconcile agency with more traditional or conventional conceptions of what younger students should focus on, such as literacy and numeracy, which maybe, especially amongst the general public, is seen as particularly important to secure in the younger years of education, or do you not see them in conflict at all, but actually is complementary?
I think it's important to acknowledge that this represents a change from a traditional approach to curriculum, and we're very aware of that, and we acknowledge that. How we're planning to, I suppose, work towards addressing this is to see this as a negotiation over time with teachers to facilitate negotiations between teachers and children. And we believe that over time, whatever issues that might arise initially in terms of thinking around where this might conflict or maybe compromise what are perceptions of the outcomes from a more traditional approach, we feel that over time, that when teachers have lived experiences of seeing the positive outcomes for children, that will support them in adopting change and maybe adopting this more contemporary view around working with children, allowing children to shape their own learning experiences as well. And I mean, look, you know, the book talks about structured freedom. It's not necessarily a free-for-all. That's certainly not what we're suggesting in the redeveloped curriculum. We're talking about teachers and children and other wider stakeholders as well, working together to negotiate what this will look like if this is to work across a given setting, across different circumstances and situations.
Thank you. I think we'll have to move on to the third speaker. I'm sorry if there are any questions left unasked. Our third keynote speaker is Susan O'Neill, our professor and our head of department of learning and leadership, to whom we are very grateful for making this talk in person. And the talk is called Amplifying Children's Agency in Schools, Insights from Child-Led Participatory Action Research. And the reason I'm delighted to see this title is because we strongly believe in the Centre that the most genuine way to research children's agency is by engaging with children themselves. So I very much look forward to hearing about this study. Please.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Yana. I appreciate that. It's a great pleasure to be able to join the seminar today. What a valuable topic to bring us all together, and particularly that we have breakneck speed there. There we go. That we have the scholarship to base it upon that you've developed for us, and it's really thought-provoking in many ways. So I thank you, Dom and Yana, for the invitation. Yes, so what I thought I could contribute here is that most of my scholarship for several decades has focused on children's engagement in learning. So in particular, and my focus is often in the area of the arts. And one of the things that I came across for many years is that the most transformative part of engagement I would see in children, and certainly where I would see agency thriving, is when we were involved in child-led participatory action research with children or youth. It's a real partnership and a real commitment between the researchers and the educator and the children. But I'm just hoping to talk you through it a little bit and give you an example of a project to bring it to life. Okay, so I'll just read here, but why should I think of it then as amplifying children's agencies? Well, decisions about curriculum and policy are typically made by adults, as we know, and students' voices are rarely invited. Children are often positioned as research subjects, not contributors, with their experiences filtered through adult interpretations. Traditional research methods prioritize adult-defined metrics, sidelining, or sometimes and often sidelining, young people's lived realities. Children's strengths and perspectives are frequently overlooked. That youth-led spaces where that agency and urgency and voice thrives will remain underexplored. that listening to young people is essential for authentic engagement with social change, that few studies explore children with children or elevate young people's lived geographies, and that educators attuned to wonder and possibility can ignite agency, even for the disaffected. And that's going right back to Maxine Green's notion of releasing the imagination. So what is CLPAR, Child-Led Participatory Action Research? Well, it's repositioning the children as co-researchers. It's granting them this meaningful ownership in the research process, the outcomes and the impacts of the research. It's, of course, rooted in critical pedagogy, social justice, and childhood studies. It's challenging traditional hierarchies by foregrounding the children's lived experiences and their nuanced understandings of peer and school culture. It's granting the children also a different shift in the power dynamics, where the adults are now serving more as facilitators, and also, importantly, providing safeguarding ethics and providing that methodological scaffolding, or, as we've been speaking about already, those frameworks we've been speaking about. So it is structured freedom, very, very much so. So the aim of the study I wanted to tell you about in the Canadian context was Music Matters. Excuse me. We also have repeated many ways doing Sports Matters and Arts Matters, and also all the subject areas with children in schools. But this one was particularly, I think, a good example for you today. The aims were to engage children in reflective thinking about why young people value learning music. And the reason I focus on value in my research as an engagement researcher is that it's valuing rather than competence that will be the best predictor of long-term sustainability in an activity, particularly an activity where there's choice, whether you continue to do music or not as you move through school. It was to gain the insider knowledge from the children, to increase our understanding of the way knowledge about music learning was constructed, used, and exchanged, to engage the children in making a valued contribution that would promote equity in music education practices by building a culture of knowers. And I say a little bit more about this, but it comes back to that idea of valuing music. Children often get involved in music in schools without really, in a more technical way, in a more a very directed education way, rather than in a way that's really helping to instill the values about music in the world and the love and its place of it. So that's what I mean more by the knowers culture. And developing leadership skills and awareness of the need for children's advocacy. Again, I'll say something more about that in a minute. So in this study, we had a mix, because in the elementary school that would go straight up to probably about 13 before they would then go on to secondary school. So it's a little bit longer, I think, in some ways than some of the primary here. But we had the 10 to 12-year-olds. So we met with the teacher and myself, another researcher, every Friday for 12 weeks for this study for 90 minutes with the children. They were engaged in a series of discussions about their musical and artistic activities, what keeps them involved, and the impact on their lives. They also then discussed important messages about why music and the arts matter to the various stakeholders in the school. You'll see that in a minute. They chose their own groups to develop inquiry projects. These inquiry projects were based on their own interests, and the adult co-researchers visited the groups to assist, of course, all the way along. Each session, we came back with a sharing session about what we had done that day, and they were all videotaped, transcribed, discussed together, presented in relation to the themes that we all pulled out collectively with the children to the teacher education students at the university. So they got to go right through to dissemination of presenting their work and what they found, and engaging in conversation with educators. So this is just an example of one of the activities. Why does music matter at your school? Or then we would put it in these different contexts. You can see to you, they're saying, well, it gets your mind off homework. You can express yourself. It enriches your life. You can show your progress. It keeps you calm. It keeps you active, and it's just for fun. And then the different groups that the children were involved in, self-creating. They wanted to create a motivational message to help other art students continue. They felt that one of the biggest things is sustainability of engagement in these activities. They talked a lot about how to be inspired and write music and stay together. So they interviewed a local band that came into the school. That was a very exciting day. One of the things that was interesting about that one for me was big focus with that band was, how do you stay together? How every time we try to form a band, we argue and we break up, and so they were really, again, it was really a piece about sustainment of engagement. It's something that they enjoyed. And then they created a documentary, another group, about why music matters to the students, parents, and other adults in their school. Some things that the children had said. It was the first time anyone asked me why music mattered. I got to share my story, and people actually listened, not like pretending to listen, but really listening. That made me feel like my voice mattered, like I wasn't just a kid in the background. Before this, I didn't think my ideas about music mattered, but when I got to help with the research, I realized my thoughts were actually important. I feel like a real part of something. And it was like being in a band, but for thinking. We all brought our own sounds and ideas and put them together to make something cool. Grown-ups actually listened for once. So the children's documentary that they had made was shown to all of the school, and it was, of course, on YouTube, and it got picked up by a local news station. And right at that time, the local council, decided to cut the school music programs. And so they had, somehow, this video got shown, and the counselors invited the children to come to the council office and ministry office to discuss the importance of music to them. And to make a long story short, through a various process that happened, they decided to reinstate the music program. So if you can't have an example of agency where children really made a difference, I don't know a better one. They actually were able to achieve that. So for me, the child-led participatory action research, it has transformative potential for participants, for the researchers, and the educational practice. We were all changed in the process of working with these children over this time. It really fostered, you could see their critical thinking, their confidence growing, and their form of collaborative inquiry. It challenges those traditional hierarchies and foregrounds children's lived experience and insights, sharing power within the research process. And remember, of course, it isn't just research. We know that, and not in the traditional sense. I once had a researcher in the back of the room presenting on this say, well, I can see what's in it for the children and the school and the educators, but what's in it for the researchers? I thought that was a really interesting question about, how much work we still have to do to get asked a question like that, because it's a democratic process, a dynamic, organic, messy, layered, fluid, and adaptable process, an approach to reimagine research relationships and to affirm and amplify children's agency in the process. And it provided new insights. For example, we went on to develop advocacy as a pedagogical approach in schools. And it's a whole nother talk, but it was a really powerful concept too from this work. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. The quotes from children that you shared reminded me of a lot of things that I heard from the research that we did. It's deeply moving. Thank you very much for sharing them. Any questions for Susan, please? Emily?
Yep. So we have a question from Naomi, which I think touches on what you were just saying at the end there, Susan. How does child-led participatory action research navigate adult control over the initial research question? What if the children want to take the research focus in a different direction?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there's probably a lot of variation on a theme with child-led participatory action research about what you're trying to do. If you're trying to co-construct research with children, you probably wouldn't start where we started. You'd probably start even earlier with them in conversation about the kinds of questions they have, the kinds of knowledge they're seeking, so there is a whole approach that would do that. In our case, we knew that we came in with the idea of wanting to find out about how they value something. So we already had our idea of what we wanted to hear from them. Sometimes people would imagine that you could have done that through interviews. Why didn't you just interview the children and ask them why they value music? But you can see the difference, I think, between the kind of information you would get from an interview where there's still the power issue at stake. You're still the unknown researcher coming in, no matter how much time you spend building relationships with them, as opposed to an empowering project that enables them to choose the directions they would take with it. So I think it's a great question, and there are various entry points with it. What really matters is that the frameworks, the philosophy of what you're doing is really strong. and that you're constantly reflective, in your practice with what's happening.
Thank you. Other questions in the audience? Someone who's not gotten a chance yet? Lucy, please.
Thanks. So I was very struck by the quote. It made me feel like my voice mattered, because I ran a project, and one of the children's, I remember very clearly, said, it made me feel like I actually mattered, like I'm actually good at something. And I wondered, I guess, in research terms, one of the problems, you always come up against is seen as soft. Yes, that's great, but are they getting better academic outcomes? And it's very difficult, that area of research. And I wonder, what sort of innovations are there in terms of research to capture the impact? I mean, those two quotes are fundamental, and I'm actually good at something, i.e. most of the time they don't feel good at something, therefore most of the time they're probably not doing their best. How does one sort of provide the evidence to support this in spaces where the focus is purely on, outcomes? How do they do in their SATs in year 6?
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, it is one of the difficulties, I think, with this kind of research, being able to show impact like that. We're not measuring things pre and post. We're not saying, oh, their confidence improved. We're doing it in a way that is more about how the children imagine they've changed and they feel about themselves, and that's the outcome for us. But I think that what's interesting in what you've said is who gets selected for these kinds of projects. And I didn't say much about that because I really feel that anybody can be doing this kind of work with any children. But the teachers did not let the children who are doing really well out of classes to be in this project. These were the children they said, oh, you can have them. They were the children they had already given up on to a large extent, and felt that maybe some enrichment project like this would be, of value to them. So there's so much context around when we start to operate in the school and what we have to work with. So when I think about those children coming in, that their voice is saying the things that they said, they really mean it. They've really been underrepresented. The one thing they did love was their music program. It was being cut. They were upset. There were a lot of things going on that I think made the timing just right for this project. I think that that's a sensitivity researchers need to work, to think of the notion of reciprocity when you're going into a context to do this kind of work with children. It's not about only what you are going to get out of it, or it has to be sensitively managed for it to be transformative, for it to actually do the things that you're talking about. So a lot of the emphasis is on how we set it up. Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. I believe we're out of time. We need to carry on. Thank you very much for the talk. Dom, would you like to join me?
Yes, I
on
would.
Stage? It's our time to share some thoughts with you. Dom, would you like to start?
I thought you were going to start.
We have discussed this, and you are the one who is going to start.
Very well. First of all, I just want to say, Susie, thank you so much. Tracy, thank you so much, and I will be in touch to say more about how much your input has mattered, and it really has made me think and made the event already something that I feel quite proud about. So thank you to all concerned. What do I want to say? Well, we're now moving into the bit where we launch the book, and you'll even get a drink and a little bit to eat if you fancy that, but not straight away. Obviously, Yana and I have been working on this for 4 years, shall we say? And of course, in order, as you probably know, in order to even get some money out of these funders, you have to have a pretty good idea in the first place. You have to have a bit of luck with your reviewers, etc., etc. So we were working on it long before, and indeed you've already mentioned our first project when Yana joined the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Pedagogy, and we had our project looking at how might, as it was, the curriculum in Ireland define knowledge. And that was the task we were set, wasn't it? And it did inspire us ultimately to where we are today. So I could choose a lot of things to talk about, but what I've chosen is to start thinking about where we are in England. I should point out that we're very pleased already that people working in very different contexts internationally have found things of resonance to their context. But I do want to say something about England, mainly because, as has already been, I'm sorry Mark ended up with the question about what might happen in terms of England's national curriculum review. But we are at a crucial point in England where we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to, as in fact, I noticed Charlotte's arrived, as we said, Charlotte, in our book, evolution, not revolution, was our phrase, wasn't it? We've not been cited. We've not been cited for that. But within that idea that the curriculum in England the national curriculum could evolve, actually you can be quite radical within an evolution. And it doesn't mean, as has already been said, for example, that we're throwing everything out, that it's going to be a free-for-all for children. But so far, and I did pen a blog post on this, so far the word agency I don't think appears anywhere in any of the documents produced by the National Curriculum Review. Not once. And in fact, the only time that children are mentioned is, admittedly, it is important that children learn stuff. Yes, we can all agree that. But if the idea is that the primary national curriculum in England is so good that really it doesn't need any change, and that all the problems, if there are any, lie at secondary level and further education level, I just don't buy that. It's wrong. And I suppose, if I may just talk about some of my own contribution, not just this book, but to studying curriculum, you know, we're at a point in time when our centre and myself and working with colleagues have produced several externally funded, in some cases longitudinal studies directly about the national curriculum, how knowledge might be represented and so on. And so far, I haven't had the invitation directly from the review team to talk to them. I find that a bit of a surprise, but you know, it's not all about me, I know. It's about Yana as well. However, it hasn't stopped me making my views clear, and I'm going to finish now, Yana, by just saying that I think teacher agency needs looking after, properly looking after, but even more, we have to seriously think about children's agency. And it doesn't have to be perceived as some sort of radical, wacky idea that we actually should think structurally, logically, and with passion about what do children want in their primary national curriculum. So far, apart from one rather small number of primary children have been asked about this, there's nothing there. And if the final report is of the same ilk, then I will be sorely disappointed. And on that depressing note, I'll hand over to you, Yana, for some more positive...
Thank you, Dom. I don't have slides either. I will share some very personal reflections, actually, because I think we've heard enough about the theoretical aspects of agency, what it looks like to do research with children methodologically. So I'd like to share some thoughts that are personal to me about this research. I would like to ask to bring up the cover of the image of the book at some point, because I will refer to it at the end of my talk. Gathan, if this is possible, just to have the cover of the book on screen. Thank you. So we were, as part of the dissemination strategy, we were preparing a range of outputs for all sorts of media outlets. There was one quote that we heard from a child in the study that we wanted to include, which was that, and I quote, the child said, well, adults can do what they want and children are stuck somewhere in prison. And we were asked repeatedly to cut this quote out. Now I have an opportunity to be uncensored, so I haven't agreed this with Dom, but I'm sure I will. Even if I get into trouble, it's for the sake of representing children's views correctly. So we were really struck by this quote. The reason we were asked to remove it from all sorts of media outputs that we were producing is because it sounded too dramatic, it sounded too sensationalist. It's just one child, they told us, and it's distracting from the core of the findings. Now, the reason I want to include this quote today is because I think it's exactly what our findings are about. It might be just one child, even though the sentiment was shared among children that we did research with. It might sound dramatic, it does, it might be sensationalist, but it is by no way distracting from the core of what we want to communicate in this book. I think it's deeply sad that this is how children feel in the school, given how many years they spend in school. We talked with children extensively about their experiences and how it actually feels, not what they are trying to achieve, not the outcomes, but how does it feel for them to be in school? And what we've heard was consistently, it's boring, it's irrelevant, it has nothing to do with, it's stifling, it has nothing to do with me. It does sound a lot like prison, does it not? So, I was coming to this talk today, to the IOE, and I was listening to an audiobook completely unrelated to research in children, but it did have a quote from Dewey, who apparently said, and I just learned this today, that the process and the purpose of education should be essentially the same thing, or are essentially the same thing. And I think that's what we have forgotten, that it's not just the outcomes, it's not just the purpose, but also what does it feel like for children to, what is the process like? What is the experience like? And what we've heard from children in the study is that having a little bit of choice in learning makes dramatic difference to how they feel about learning, to what it feels like for them to be in school. They're much more engaged, they're much more motivated to learn, and they enjoy the process of learning much more. And we didn't have to make those connections ourselves. They told us that what makes this difference is that they have some choice over any aspect. It might be what they learn, how they demonstrate their learning, any aspect that they can choose instantly makes them more engaged, motivated, and the whole process just much more enjoyable. A few months ago, the Parliament launched an inquiry into the declining rates of learning among children in the UK, which I understand the intention behind it is to collect some evidence or some views on how can we make children enjoy or love learning more. I think anyone who talked today, who's done any research with children on Children's Agency has a simple answer. Let them choose more of it. And the reason I want to finish on this slide is because I don't think anyone beyond my team knows, I only need 1 minute, is that on the cover of the book is my niece, Sophia. She's on the play. It's not a staged picture, it's the picture from a family archive, but it was just very fitting. It's on the playground in Moscow, where children and adults are restricted in the way they can express their freedoms in all sorts of ways. But what I wish for Sophie is the same what I wish for every child in the world, which is that they enjoy schools, their schooling years, not just endure them.
Thank you, Yana. So I'm going to suggest now that we draw this part of tonight to a close. Yana and I are obviously around so we can answer questions and get into further conversations. I just want to say a huge thanks. I can see on this screen Tracy and Mark, and Susie again. It's so grateful to you for your talks. I won't expect Tracy and Mark to stay online while we have a drink. That would be unfair. But do have a drink in your own time if that's what you fancy. But I'll be in touch. So thank you, everyone. Do make your way to the back. Help yourself to a drink, and we'll continue the conversation. I think I've said everything I have to say, Yana.
Same here.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.